to this wonderful talk at the Center for American Studies and Research, which tonight is co-sponsored by the Media Studies program. It's my real and deep pleasure to welcome Marita Sturkin today. Marita Sturkin is a professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. She is author of many books, some of which I have with me here today are Tangled Memories, The Vietnam War, the AIDS Epidemic, and the Politics of Remembering from 1997 from University of California Press. Her latest book was Tourists of History, Memory, Kitsch, and Consumerism from Oklahoma City to Ground Zero in 2007 from Duke University Press. I also really like her book on Thelma and Louise, but most people won't talk about that. So I believe that she's also working on a book which is about American Empire, post 9/11 culture, and memory and visuality, some of which will be discussed in her talk for us today. So please join me in welcoming Marita Sturkin.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the great things about having doctoral students is that you learn a lot from them, and this is my first time in Beirut, and everything I know about Beirut I've learned from Hatem and from May. And they have been part of a group of students that has really expanded my own knowledge in ways that I'm grateful for. So I want to talk a little bit today. Can you see these images? Is that going to be okay? Yeah. Is there a way to keep the air but have slightly better images? I want to talk a little bit today about the process of rebuilding the city in Lower Manhattan. No, it's okay. Just use your imagination. So I want to talk about the process of rebuilding Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, but I want to situate that in a larger context of the rebuilt city. Of course, I knew something about the rebuilt city in reading Hatem's dissertation, but now that I've had a tour of the rebuilt city in Beirut, I think that the comparison to Beirut is quite fascinating, so perhaps we can talk about some of that afterwards. In the vast history of cities in the modern world can be seen through the prism of destruction, rebuilding, and reinvention. And certainly if we look at the 20th and 21st centuries in particular, obviously cities were destroyed before then, the city has been this very kind of profound site of global conflict and of renewal. We have only to look at the images circulating of the ruins of Aleppo to think about the previous destruction of other cities, including Berlin, Sarajevo, Baghdad, and of course Beirut. One can be tempted in reflecting on this history to think of the city as a kind of organism that has resilience and the capacity to regenerate. But cities are not really organisms. They're sites where politics are materialized and enacted, where economics, politics, culture, design, and population management intersect with discourses of commerce, business, religion, public space, and real estate. And of course, the context that we're seeing now, both here and in New York, is a context in which real estate is the key engine of global finance culture. In the context of the global history of urban destruction, the rebuilding of Ground Zero in New York seems relatively minor by comparison. The site of destruction in New York in 2001 was famously only 16 acres in a very large city. Yet the events of 9/11 loom so large in history now that the site itself is one of extreme overdetermination. The events of 9/11 have been subject from the very beginning to exceptionalist discourses, of US exceptionalism, right, one in a long history of posing the United States as an exemplary nation, and of 9/11 exceptionalism. All right, how am I going to do this? I guess I have to come back and forth.
We could move the computer
I don't think we actually thought about that. I'll move it. Can I move it over here? That's better. Okay. Great. So 9, exceptionalism, that defines the events of September 11th as a unique event of global terrorism, one in which the United States is an innocent and resilient player, and that's usually coincides with the narrative that we were attacked out of the blue. Ironically, as US culture remains mired in what can only be defined as a post-9/11 era of American history, the overdetermination of 9/11 as an event seems to fit the devastation that followed in its wake. 9/11 exceptionalism has had deep political consequences, since it effectively justified the changing of legal norms and moral stances that followed in its wake. So while on one hand I want to critique those exceptionalist discourses, I also want to argue that day in 2001 was a moment that did change the nation. When we think of all that emanated from it, the wars that were fought in revenge, the privatization of war, the secret prisons, the drone war, the proliferation of torture, the Patriot Act, security culture, the financial crisis, political dysfunction, massive surveillance, the list goes on. Inevitably, of course, this has devastating global consequences. The problem of American empire is, of course, a global problem. 9/11 exceptionalism is deeply materially embedded at Ground Zero. All of the rebuilding at Ground Zero, from its memorial and its museum to its office buildings, architectural designs, securitization, has been contingent on the narrative that it is an event so exceptional that the site could only be rebuilt in reference to the events of that day. That it is the site of an event with few parallels in history. This means that the sense of the epic scale of the event has been translated materially into spaces that are designed to evoke awe, spectacle, and massive importance. It has also been the site of many imaginaries. A site of memory and mourning. It is now a tourist destination with souvenirs, an architectural showcase with buildings designed by global architects, an area defined by defense. With the opening of the 9/11 Museum, and here you can see early on there was a lot of mapping onto the site of imaginaries of it, especially of the footprints being designated. With the opening of the 9/11 Museum in May 2014 and the Santiago Calatrava designed Oculus Transportation Hub in March 2016, the site is nearing a semblance of completion more than 15 years after 9/11. It's not incidental that, like the wars that followed in its wake, the rebuilding of Ground Zero has come at an extraordinary price tag, most of it public funds. It's a very complicated, I'm happy to talk about this later, a very complicated intermix of public and private funds, federal funds as well as state funds. One World Trade Center, which is owned as the towers were by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, with the lease owned by commercial real estate magnate Larry Silverstein, is at $38 billion, the most expensive building ever built. The construction of the memorial and museum cost $700 million. The much smaller Calatrava Transportation Hub, recently dubbed a symbol of the boondoggle, costs an astounding $4 billion in public funds. Key factors in these costs have been mismanagement, of course, demands for defensive design, the rebuilding of destroyed infrastructure, and megalomaniac architects. The rebuilding of Lower Manhattan is about architecture, design, and memory, but it is also, of course, about nationalist politics and an affirmation of American empire. So I'd just like to talk today to try and unpack these different aspects of it in order to think about the rebuilt city in relationship to tourism, consumerism, defense culture, and memory. So how we rebuild cities matters. One of the primary narratives of 9/11, in particular in New York City, is the sense told by many that the transformation of the physicality of the site was unprecedented in its scale and speed. This sense undergirds much of the mourning that followed in its wake. Bodies were hurtled through space, vaporized without a trace, transformed into bits and pieces. 210-story buildings were inconceivably pulverized in their descent to the ground, reduced to atom-sized bits of debris. Massive objects in emergency vehicles were crushed as if they were children's toys. Powerful steel beams were bent and twisted into strange shapes. Not only was there very little recognizable debris in relationship to what had once stood there, but the swiftness of the transformation is perceived to have been unusual, a matter of mere minutes from a before until an after. The sense of an unusual kind of material transformation is a sort of key narrative here of 9/11 exceptionalism. Initially, this was manifested most powerfully in the dust, a strange, uncanny substance that blanketed lower Manhattan, signaling the sense of a world undone. The fall of the buildings and their extreme material transformation into dust enabled one of the primary narratives that has dominated Ground Zero since its inception, that of absence. From the moment the two buildings fell, there was an obsessive preoccupation with their erasure from the New York City skyline. So there emerged another preoccupation enacted both in public discourse and in design of the void. The story of 9/11 is in many ways a story of architecture as well as terrorism. The terrorists who targeted the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center did so because of the way in which they read the architecture as symbols not only of global US-based capitalism, but of US as empire. In the immediate aftermath of the destruction of the Twin Towers, calls were made by politicians and architects alike to rebuild the towers, taller and bigger than before, testimony to the ways in which the loss of the buildings was seen as emasculating. While few design professionals wanted to admit it, the destruction of Lower Manhattan created opportunities for architecture. And architecture has been a key factor in the rebuilding in the site, as well as, I should say, a lot of imaginings of it. So in the first year, there were official design contests, and then there were many unofficial ones. So the design community treated rethinking the site almost as a kind of mourning. The architectural remaking of Ground Zero has been dominated by the concept of sacred ground. This was particularly acute in relationship to the footprints of the Twin Towers, which were declared by politicians and others to be sacred, quote, from bedrock to infinity. The idea of sacred ground has severely restricted, and in particular that the footprints are sacred ground, has severely restricted the capacity to see the area as a neighborhood and has limited potential reimaginings of the space. The perceived sacredness of the footprints led to an architectural preoccupation with the void. This is most clearly manifested in the 9/11 memorial by Michael Arad. Its original name was Reflecting Absence, focusing the attention on memorialization, not only on the dead, but on the Twin Towers, defining the space as one of absence rather than presence. The memorial's primary feature consists of two very large pools of water cascading downward into two voids that fill the former footprints of the towers. The design feature of the void has been a trend of contemporary architecture, in particular in the work of architect Daniel Libeskind, who was the master planner of the Ground Zero site. The architectural design of the void intends to convey a sense of loss through the creation of negative spaces that physically appear empty. They're not quite immaterial. They are, by definition, material spaces that aim to convey the absence of materiality. One does not experience the voids of the memorial as necessarily being filled with the water that cascades into them. And here you can see it's like Niagara Falls. The design of the memorial creates a series of tensions between absence and presence, the massive, the intimate, the solid, and the fleeting. Architecturally, the remade site of Ground Zero bears the corporate legacy of the World Trade Center buildings whose destruction created it. The World Trade Center complex, the original one, was a notoriously inhospitable site at ground level, with a windswept plaza cut off from the street grid of downtown by the design of a superblock, which is very common urban design of the mid-20th century. The new Memorial Plaza is demarcated from the surrounding streets, surrounded by security bollards, and it's a heavily securitized area. while the plaza space should improve over time because there are trees there that are desperately trying to grow, it is not conducive to public gathering, though it is now crowded with tourists. So there is a way in which the public space aspect is overshadowed by the presence of the memorial. So when you are in that space, you're supposed to be looking into the void of the memorial rather than experiencing it as public space. And the voids are, of course, the absence of public space by design. The tension of absence and presence evident in the memorial is also a key framework of the experience of the 9/11 Museum, which is situated in the vast underground space, 100,000 square feet of ground zero, where the original underground complex of shopping and transportation of the World Trade Center was once housed. The architectural design, oh, here's another view of the plaza. The architectural design of the museum underground. Here's the pavilion of the museum was done by Snøhetta, which is a Danish-American design firm. Looks in tone and aesthetic quite different from the rest of the museum. But the majority of the design is done by the New York architecture firm Davis Brody Bond, which really effectively curates the site as you enter into it. The museum was mandated to provide meaningful access to several archaeological aspects of the site: the bedrock, the footprints of the original towers, and the slurry wall of the original complex that held back the Hudson River. The primary feature of the architectural design is a broad ribbon walkway that brings visitors down into the central space, and where they then come in and stop at a vista point. So the experience is designed in many ways to have these points where one looks out into the space with awe, a space coded as a space of absence. And then they have excavated the column footprint. So here, actually, you are under the pool, which is the space that surrounds the pool is kind of clad in aluminum. And then the galleries are under there, but they've excavated the original column footprints, which actually strangely have this very powerful effect. So even though one might want to critique the fetishizing of the footprints, the actual archaeological material presence of them is quite evocative. So a lot in the design is about making it a space to look into with awe. 9/11, the event, was defined by spectacle and massive scale, and the rebuilding of Ground Zero has echoed this preoccupation with scale. As I noted, there were calls by architects and politicians alike in the weeks after 9/11, when the site was still a smoking pile of debris and death, to build the towers back up, bigger and better than before, as an act of defiance. This simplistic equation of size with power and of architectural prowess with national symbolism has guided the designs, many of the designs for rebuilding the site. When Libeskind, who is best known, was certainly best known at that time for the design of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, won the competition in 2002 to design the master plan, he proposed a tall, delicate, tapering tower surrounded by a spiral of lower buildings and cultural centers. And you can see he even put well, you can't really see it, but he put trees up in the tower. The tallest tower, designated at 1776 feet to echo U.S. independence by Libeskind, whose work can be kitsch in its patriotic symbolism, and he often likes to pose it against the Statue of Liberty, and which was also then dubbed the Freedom Tower, was quickly taken over by political entities governing the site, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation and the Port Authority, and assigned to corporate architect David Childs of Skidmore, Owings, Merrill. The resulting building, which is only partially open today, 13 years later, has been largely received as an emblem of banality, an empty symbol of hollowed out power. New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman wrote when it opened, Quote, "I find myself picturing General MacArthur in aviator sunglasses when I see the building. Its mirrored exterior is opaque, shellacked, monomaniacal. An abbreviated obelisk, the building rises to 104 stories atop a square, 20-story concrete bunker, only partly disguised behind butterfly-like louvered glass panels." In order for the building to qualify for the absurdly meaningless title of the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, it was extended to 1776 feet by a skinny antenna from its actual height of 1368. There's a long history in the US of counting antennas in the heights of buildings. This actually, one of the most famous examples is the Empire State Building in the 1930s. Here, Kimmelman notes, counting the antenna is like counting relish at a hot dog eating contest. He was really having fun with that review. So, and you can see now there's also this aim to picture it by itself, as if it's not in the skyline. The scale of the building is thus, in a painfully simplistic way, that remains largely unexamined in the world of architecture and real estate development, meant to symbolize national power, resilience, masculine prowess. And what was really narrated over many years as a kind of FU to Al-Qaeda in the form of architecture. I need not spend time here elaborating on why very tall skyscrapers do not make sense as buildings, even economically, since the engineering costs necessary to move people to upper floors negates the benefits of those extra floors, or why they are deeply unhuman. Let's not forget that they can be profoundly dangerous, as the Twin Towers were once hit. Those thousands of people were killed by the buildings collapsing more than any other aspect of that event. They are also extremely dangerous in cases of natural disaster and fire. These buildings, whether built for the display of political power or wealth, and in New York City now we've had this rash of extremely tall buildings really reshaping the skyline, which are largely very expensive condo towers owned by shell companies that mask ownership in shady global capital. Sounds a little like downtown Beirut, right? Are not designed to be functional or human in scale. The most notable aspect of One World Trade Center, beyond its banality and its price tag, is its security architecture, which I might add really does, more than its height, make it a symbol of post-9/11 US culture. Since it is presumed to always be a target because of its scale, it has been designed to withstand any potential attack that can be imagined within the security parameters today, or maybe we should say the security imaginary today, which is of course going to constantly change. This means not only that it sits on a 20-story concrete bunker, but also the area surrounding its entrance is essentially cordoned off by security bollards and forbids any street-level activity. There are no storefronts in the building or close to it. It has a restaurant and a viewing platform on its upper floors to attract tourists. But its floors contain, and here you can see an ad for the observatory, contain, like the original World Trade Center, offices housing the Port Authority and now Condé Nast publishers, who were presumably given a phenomenally good deal to be the first anchor tenant. Stories of workers unhappy at being assigned in the building abound. So scale and defense. Scale is a form of defense. Defense is an inevitable outcome of massive scale. It's as if the site were caught up in its own spiraling set of meanings that feed on each other. While it's not a particularly large structure, the Calatrava Transportation Hub, which consists of an underground station for the PATH trains to New Jersey and connections to the subway, several subway lines actually, with a large above-ground structure of arching white winged forms, it is also very much about scale. It was assigned early on to Calatrava, who is known both for building inspirational structures and for going over budget, and it's largely praised initially for its signification of hope and renewal. Now that it's nearing completion, and it is partially opened now, this is the concourse that will soon be filled with shops. The signification of its structure seems less obvious. At times it looks cathedral-like, at others it looks like a curved fish skeleton. As the New York Times wrote last year, its soaring structure can seem both like a luminous and majestic space, or, and here another particularly American metaphor, like a turkey skeleton that has been stripped clean at Thanksgiving. As you can see, the structure deploys scale as a kind of dramatic flourish. But because this main room, here this is going in, you can see the turnstiles there. The main room is actually going to be a shopping mall en route to the trains, which will be at much lower levels. It's not clear what the message of cathedral embrace will ultimately mean. Perhaps it will be a cathedral to consumerism. Nevertheless, it is a stunningly unusual sight amid the bland towers that are being built at Ground Zero. Scale is also a key feature of the 9/11 memorial that sits next to One World Trade Center, and as I'm sure has been clear from the photos that I've shown previously. Indeed, the two huge pools of the memorial are so overpowering in scale that they overshadow all the other elements of the memorial, including its most important feature, which are the names that are carved around the edges. The element of water is intended to mediate the feeling the pools could potentially convey of what one critic calls empty parking garages. Yet they are so large, each is the size of a city block, as the original towers were, that they overpower all activity around their perimeters. They make it practically impossible to have an experience of intimacy there. Here I would note as well that there's a kind of twinning aspect too, which was part of what people loved about the towers, this kind of dynamism of the two that doesn't really work here. All the studies that the museum has done has shown that people go and spend 15 to 20 minutes at the first pool, and then they go spend 5 minutes at the second pool because, after all, it looks just like the first one. Museum visitors are confronted with the question of scale from the moment they enter into the plaza-like pavilion and pass through the elaborate security apparatus, as the first objects that they see as they come down the escalator are these tridents, which are huge remnants of the outer skin of the original towers. So this was a real distinguishing feature of the original towers, that they were very modern, but they had this Gothic-inspired skin. These stand in the entrance to the pavilion. They actually had to be installed before the building was completed because they're so large, where they really loom over you as you come in. They have also been called two oversized forks by many people, with their kind of counter signification. So this brings us back to the larger question of scale as a constant theme of the memory of 9/11 and its political meanings. The bigness of the site, the vastness of the memorial pools, the huge space of the underground museum, the immense size of many of the objects on display, they all converge to convey the sense of 9/11 as an event of massive importance. It should be noted, of course, the ways that this massive scale undergirds narratives of 9/11 exceptionalism enables, amongst other things, the valuing of the almost 3,000 deaths that took place on September 11, more than the hundreds of thousands who have died in the wars that followed in its wake. Scale is such a pervasive factor at the site that it's really worth putting under scrutiny because it is so normalized. It's impossible, for instance, to talk today about how the site could contain a much, much smaller memorial and museum and still be a very powerful place to visit. So I want to turn to talk just a little bit about the experience of the museum itself, since it is now the primary destination at the site, and to look at some of the material objects on display in the museum, which are absolutely crucial to its effect. Material objects that have survived a cataclysmic event narrate their transformative state, putting on display the very transformation that turned them from ordinary objects of the everyday into what we could call survivor objects. They quite literally become storytelling devices and stand-ins for the dead. This is the antenna that used to be on top of one of the towers. An object that's mangled, partially destroyed, and crushed stands in for those absent bodies that were subject to the same destructive forces. Survivor objects can have a powerful sensory effect through their material presence in ways that engage the experiential mode of museums over the epistemological mode of museums. As viewers, we see their textures, their battered and crumpled forms, we smell their material elements. This gives them a kind of corporeality. That the material objects on display in the museum are rendered corporeal exists parallel to the fact that the site of Ground Zero is haunted by absent bodies. The bodies that were gone in an instant, the bodies that were identified in bits and pieces, testimony to the terrible violence of that day, the bodies that haunt from images, bodies falling unimaginably through space. To this day, there are family groups that continue to advocate that the dust and debris that was taken to the Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island be returned to Ground Zero because they believe that it contains remains of the dead. There are more than 1,100 bodies that have never had a trace recovered, and most of those that were recovered were found in fragments and pieces. A massive effort at DNA identification run by the New York City Medical Examiner's Office aimed to mediate the absence of bodies, but it can hardly be said to have quelled the sense of the site as haunted by bodies. The museum and the memorial attempt to evoke the bodies of the dead through certain modes of presence making, such as naming at the memorial or photographs in the memorial gallery. These images are strangely devoid of affect, though. Perhaps it is because they are so conventional and formal. But there's a range of media in the museum, but one of the things that's interesting about the sort of failure of the photograph to do what we expect it to do in this context is that the medium that really does work very profoundly well in the museum is audio. So there are several alcoves where you can go and sit and you can hear a kind of digitally sampled series of people narrating their stories of getting out of the towers, coming down onto the plaza, the horrible sounds, the police telling them to run, and then they have another one when the towers fall, and then they have a whole series that's around United 93, which includes a lot of phone calls that people made from the plane before it crashed. So you're sitting in these dark rooms, and there's just a way in which the timbre, the intonation of the voices reaches you in a different way. The museum's primary narrative is really about survival, a narrative shared by the objects on display. As objects that survived, these material remains stand in for the violence. We have, and some of them are quite large, right? Crushed ambulances, an enormous water main valve, bent pieces of steel. Each are testimony to this devastating material transformation that took place. If we look at Ladder 3 engine, beautifully lit as an object by the museum photographer, it's hard not to think of the men who once rode in it, the empty open doors, the crushed frame, the torn metal that evokes the absence of those who once inhabited it. It's a sorrowful object, but it is also an object of affirmation precisely because it survived. While the many large objects inspire awe through scale, the once ordinary objects on display in the museum, so familiar yet so transformed, convey a kind of poignancy in their altered states. ID cards, watches, keys, shoes, briefcases, they're objects of evidence of the everyday that was irrevocably disrupted. These unassuming objects evoke a kind of prior innocence of a time when the events of 9/11 were unimaginable. So here, we're reminded of the mundaneness of people going to work, riding in elevators, sitting at their desks, thinking of the small tasks of the day. This quality is perhaps strongest with those objects that were once worn by people. For instance, Jenny Gambale's wallet, torn, crumbled, and burned, was found on the roof of the Marriott Hotel. She worked for Cantor Fitzgerald on the 103rd floor of the North Tower and died that day at age 27. One of the most resonant of these objects is a watch that was once belonged to Todd Beamer, a passenger on United Flight 93. He's become famous as one of a small group of passengers who fought back the hijackers. He's the one who apparently uttered the phrase, "let's roll," as they moved forward. His watch, which was a $7,000...
Normal power cut.
It'll come back on? All right, imagine, should I turn the screen? Here's the watch. It was a $7,000 Rolex when first purchased. Indicates the violence it was subject to and the stopped moment in time, 10:10, when the plane crashed. The watch itself is a kind of miracle, that it survived at least somewhat intact, that it belonged to this person who's become famous in death as an American icon, a narrative of redemption in a story that was otherwise devastating, that it held that fateful moment in time within its mechanism, that it ended up in the museum. It is also a deeply American object, symbolizing a narrative of American identity that dominates in the museum, the can-do, don't give up spirit of resiliency that we need as citizens here, one that helps us screen out the brutal American actions that were taken in revenge for 9/11. The most controversial object in the museum, its presence the most debated before it was put on display, is the composite. This is a chunk of debris that was apparently originally 4 to 5 floors of one of the towers that are compressed into an object several feet high. While the composite contains evidence of the debris of the towers, the Office of the Medical Examiner concluded, to the consternation of some family members, that it did not contain human remains. Nevertheless, the museum treats it as a controversial object. It's placed in a discreet alcove with signage that carefully describes its status and a nearby box of tissues. The composite, its very name indicative of its uncategorizability, is disturbing because of its indeterminacy. For some family members who advocated against its inclusion, it's not an object at all, but entombed remains. Inevitably, one of the effects of the museum is the museum process is a kind of aestheticization of objects of destruction, which raises questions about the project of museumization in general. The museum put on display 2 large mangled pieces of steel, each about 30 feet long, which were taken from the first point of impact when American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower. Unfortunately, they've chosen to display these separately rather than together. One of them is set in a corner where you can't really see it very well. The other is at the end of a long corridor. We have quite a long view of it from a distance. Here you can see. The impact steel signifies evidence of the massive destructive forces of that day. Yet the fragmentary quality of the steel also makes it an object of a different sort. Standing without context at the end of this long space, it's clearly rendered into a fetish. It inevitably looks like a work of modern art. Indeed, it's practically Giacometti-like, as if its sculpturing was the result of aesthetic choices rather than an intentional act of violence. One could argue, of course, this is exactly what the process of museumization does. It turns objects of art, history, everyday life into things that signify something more, with mystical and magical qualities. The transformation of survivor objects into fetish objects is the inevitable outcome of modes of display, pedestals, lighting, barriers, signage, and the valuing of objects as part of a museum collection. The museum now has a collection of something like 10,000 objects. Yet objects like this in their display in the museum call into question the larger project of the museum in profound ways. It should not be surprising that it is in telling the story of the actual day of September 11th, the museum is at its most compelling. This is, after all, an extraordinary story, dramatic, epic in scale, deeply moving in the stories of compassion, sacrifice, of strangers helping strangers in a kind of shared humanity. In its mission to also interpret the meaning of 9/11, the museum is, not surprisingly, a deeply problematic project. We can see its contradictions in the way that it effectively justifies American empire in the objects on display. I would like to talk about this in relationship to 2 objects that are in the central foundation hall. The first is a very large steel column that stands in the middle of the room, commanding over the space. Known as the last column, this 36-foot-high steel colossus is covered with messages, missing posters, pictures, and memorial inscriptions put there by the firefighters, police, and recovery workers and other laborers who worked to clear the site at Ground Zero for 9 months. This has been much written about when it was taken out in May 2002. It had an honor guard and was draped with a flag. And it's narrated in the museum as a symbol of resilience, precisely because it survived. And it also very much about speaking to the deep ethos of public servants and engineers who worked at the site, clearing the site, many of whom have suffered in its aftermath. It's also clearly about scale. It really towers over the space, and the space itself is very, very large. Across the hall is the second object, a seemingly ordinary brick in a display case. This brick was taken from the compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden was assassinated by US Navy SEALs in 2011, and is now on display with the, there it is. And is now on display with the jacket of one of the Navy SEALs, donated by the man who wore it. A small CIA challenge coin, apparently awarded in the agency for a mission accomplished, and donated by the CIA operative, Maya, as she's also identified in the film Zero Dark 30, who led the intelligence mission to find bin Laden. The brick, here you can see it on display together. The brick was donated by Fox News reporter Dominic DiNatale, who chiseled several bricks out of the foundation of the compound before it was torn down, presumably to prevent the kind of trophy hunting that he himself participated in. According to Fox News, he stated at the time, "America is the greatest country in the world. It's the least I could do." Tragically, DiNatale, who was originally British, committed suicide in December 2014 after being diagnosed with brain damage related to injuries he received while covering the war in Iraq. And this second story is actually not told to museum visitors. The layers of tragedy in this story speak to the bitter emptiness of revenge and the impossibility of closure of the events of 9/11. The journey of the brick from Pakistan to New York seems to provide a narrative of closure, creating the sense that the brick's final destination should be in the museum on display with the artifacts of 9/11. But the presence of these two objects near each other demonstrates in many ways the contradictory aims of both the memorial and the museum. These are both survivor objects, but what different stories they tell. One speaks of public service, sacrifice, the other of revenge. Both aim for and fail in providing closure. The last column's journey is about saying the site was cleared through public service, yet the recovery workers continue to fight for health care for the health problems they acquired there. The bin Laden brick presence in the museum gestures towards the closing of the circle, and when bin Laden was killed, people did congregate at Ground Zero to celebrate the news. Yet the wars of revenge for 9/11 continue to this day. So it is that the museum can narrate survival persuasively, but is deeply flawed in its capacity to address the meaning of 9/11. The museum's representation of Islamic faith has been under regular attack from Muslim leaders and constituencies. Complaints have focused most on the film shown in the before 9/11 section of the exhibit titled The Rise of Al-Qaeda, which has been accused of equating all Muslims with jihadists and terrorists. Before the museum opened, its administrators refused to respond to a call by an interfaith group of religious leaders to change the film and make those distinctions clearer. In the gallery after the film, there are photographs of the 9/11 hijackers. This very representation, of course, was protested by the families. But these are placed low on the wall, actually at like thigh level, as if such placement would mediate the fraught feelings produced by the images. Part of the problem here relates to the broader question of chronology. When does 9/11 begin and end? Historians might argue that 9/11 begins with the rise of Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, or with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, or with the United States' political engagement with Saudi Arabia, and so on. Each step backward into the deep narrative of political decisions and events that produced the attack of September 11th, itself the most spectacular in a series of terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda, can be perceived as spreading the blame and responsibility for what happened that day. And then, since the US is still politically in the post-9/11 era, when does the event of 9/11 end? Here is perhaps the museum's greatest shortcoming, and maybe shortcoming is even a kind word. A small room contains one image of Guantanamo, one poster about a protest against the war in Iraq, one small picture of Afghanistan, one mention of the Patriot Act. Visitors then exit the gallery to see the bin Laden brick. That the events of 9/11 tragically drove the United States with enormous public support to enter two disastrous and costly wars, both ongoing more than a decade later, that resulted in hundreds of thousands dead and contributed to a devastating destabilization of the Middle East, is not a story that can be addressed within a museum that identifies itself as a museum of memorialization. The dead are used here, intentionally or not, to justify all that was perpetrated in their names. I would be remiss, of course, if I did not take you to the gift shop. The Memorial and Museum at Ground Zero are now a primary destination in New York. They draw tens of thousands of visitors every day. This is a view of a typical tour that would take you to the memorial, to the museum, and then up into the observatory of the One World Trade Center, still called the Freedom Tower by the tourist industry, though not by the real estate industry, who figured out that that was not good for selling space. The 9/11 Memorial Museum is thus so many conflicting things. Not only is it a memorial to those who died, a historical museum, a shrine, and a tourist destination, but it is also a commercial venture. This is indicated not simply by its $24 admission fee, though it's free for the families of the dead, but also in its selling of merchandise related to 9/11. The gift shop has drawn the most negative attention in all of the assessments of the museum. Here's the very discreet entrance to it. It is, of course, on your way out of the museum, exit through the gift shop. The New York Post called it the little shop of horror, quipping, "Visit mass grave, buy a t-shirt." The highest level of derision was initially aimed at the September 11th cheese plate.
Oh, God.
With hearts marking Shanksville, New York, and the Pentagon. It was withdrawn by the museum when the criticism reached a crescendo. Crass is among the most common adjectives used to describe the merchandise for sale in the shop. The selling of 9/11 merchandise, much of it kitsch, has taken place since the first weeks after September 11th. Much of it unofficial street merchandise of informal economies, some of it in more official stores, all of it produced in China and Korea. It's important to note that there are several different categories of merchandise for sale in the gift shop. Much of the merchandise is pedagogical, books, films, photographic books. Another key category is that of comfort objects, intended both for children and adults, stuffed FDNY teddy bears, rescue dogs, animal-related merchandise. There are many items that we would call souvenirs, many of which celebrate the FDNY and the NYPD, merchandise of New York boosterism that has existed long prior to the loss of many public servants that day. A significant amount of the merchandise, however, is what we might call domestic merchandise. This is typical for museum gift shops in general, like a museum like the Metropolitan Museum, for instance, which generate a lot of income by selling household objects, clothing, and jewelry. But this is a much more tricky enterprise in relation to memorial museums. While souvenirs in general are intended to be put on display, domestic merchandise is intended for quotidian life. A hoodie or a t-shirt with the Twin Towers logo is intended to be worn. A coffee mug, through its very materiality, implies an integration into daily life, so that not only is its presence at the breakfast table appropriate, but it is expected. The museum logo attached to these items of daily life signifies a trace of the site itself, awarding the everyday object a particular kind of moral posture that an ordinary hoodie or coffee cup would not carry. It hardly needs to be stated that souvenirs that align the story of 9/11 with patriotism, jingoism, and narratives of resilience are screening over the complexity of the story of 9/11. Here's a few more United We Stand blankets. Interestingly, architectural style is a key factor in commodifying the story of 9/11 in the gift shop. A key theme of the museum's commissioned merchandise takes the design. Here they resurrected this Fischietti ceramics that had that were from the 80s that had the Twin Towers in them. And then this is the merchandise that they created, which replicates this Gothic skin that is this sort of was the signature of the original Twin Towers, transforming it into serving dishes, scarves, and ties. It's an odd decision, but one that seems to deploy nostalgia about the towers as a way to mediate the selling of merchandise itself. I've never actually seen anybody wear them. But let's pause for a second to contemplate this. Here we have the domestication of a modern architectural form of the Twin Towers into merchandise at a gift shop, at a museum that aims to confront the complexity of their destruction for political reasons. Who could have predicted such an outcome? In contemporary American culture, we are accustomed to the ways that commercialism and branding permeate all aspects of life, from the most intimate to the most public. Why then does the museum gift shop so offend? Why is it such a problem for this institution to sell this stuff? Here I think, and you know, lots of people are buying it, but it's also received a huge amount of criticism. Here I think we can return to the question of museumification and aestheticization, for the gift shop participates in a particular kind of fetishization. It does so in the classic Marxist mode of commodity fetishization, of course, because the objects in the gift shop are sold as commodities. This association of cultural memory with commodification creates anxiety. It's seen by many as inappropriate at a site dedicated to the memory of the dead. This reveals, among other things, that we have a romantic cultural association with memory as somehow unadulterated, unmediated, even though fetishization is inherent to memory objects. But this is also about conflicting value systems. The moral discourse that shapes the museum's role as a memory museum defines lives lost as priceless. Other discourses, of which there have been plenty at Ground Zero, including there was a very elaborate process of financial compensation for those who died that explicitly attached particular values to those lives lost. The commodity is obviously part of a system of exchange and valuation. And the museum's role is supposed to be about defining that loss beyond valuation. So this kind of commodity object is seen as cheapening. Here's the water bottle, the memory of those who died in the process. So it's important to ask, how did we get here? How did the violence and brutality of the attacks of September 11th end up with a heavily defended office tower and a tourist destination with a gift shop? I've written elsewhere about how US culture participates in a tourism of history in which the public is encouraged to experience US history through consumerism and tourism, to occupy the position of an outsider looking in. These practices enable the myth of American innocence to permeate our understandings of history and to help perpetrate a broad disavowal about the project of American empire as a global destructive force. Seen in this light, the 9/11 souvenir is not a simple tourist curio, but an insidious artifact, however small, that enables a larger denial of US empire. This brings me back, in conclusion, to the question of how cities rebuild and renew themselves in the wake of violence. As an actual site of urban renewal, Ground Zero is not very large, but its political importance looms in profound ways in relationship to global politics. It matters terribly how the site is rebuilt, as it does with all cities. If we think about this long arc, even from the 20th century and the rebuilding of cities like Tokyo and Berlin, to the rebuilding of cities like Beirut in the 21st. The rebuilt Ground Zero is insistently not an integrated part of the city. It exists in a certain sense in its own zone of global tourism. Tens of thousands of people visit every week. Most of them are foreign tourists. That means it occupies a symbolic terrain beyond its material placement in the city. It is from this symbolic site that its message of memory will continue to have political importance. In its reconstruction through corporate architecture, its inscription as a site of memory, and the perpetual replay of what happened that day, in its perpetuation of the myths of 9/11 exceptionalism and American empire, in its defensive, securitized design, it continues to justify all that has devastatingly emanated from that dark, smoky day. Thank you. Oh, here, I'm just going to put that up at the end. Yeah, maybe some lights.
How much money is generated through the gift shop, and is any of that money going to help the firefighters who cannot pay their medical bills and all the people who are affected by 9/11?
I don't actually know how much money that's the kind of thing they don't like to talk about. But the gift shop is intended to provide revenue for the museum itself. It's an extremely expensive project to run, and it is actually not, and I don't know why exactly, it's not part of the National Park Service. So it is run by a private foundation, essentially still headed by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who also happens to be a billionaire. And so it is perceived of as a revenue-generating source for the museum, as most museum shops are. The fight over the healthcare is taking place in Washington. Actually, Jon Stewart, right after he retired from The Daily Show, was a sort of key figure in that. But it does sort of show the contradictions inherent in the project, yeah. The merchandise is expensive, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the big question
Mm-hmm.
that people and seeing this kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing is, as you were mentioning also, how do we end to this level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how did we get here?
What is the transition
Mm-hmm.
between this architectural project,
Mm-hmm.
economical perception of New York as the world capital of capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly you need to build a memorial
Mm-hmm.
for a terrorist attack.
Mm-hmm.
And not even that, also a museum.
Mm-hmm.
So for me the question is, what could be the other option?
Mm-hmm.
If it's possible to just leave it like it was, built
Mm-hmm.
over the ashes,
Mm-hmm.
or you need to rethinking that process constantly. I don't know. I think that I come from Chile, and we also have a
Yes.
9/11.
Yes, I know. Mm-hmm. And you have a museum too.
Yeah, and we also have a museum, but not in the place where it was.
Right.
But it's this connotation of the constant memory
Mm-hmm.
and how to present it, but at the same time how to erase it. And so it's a little bit of this
Yeah.
training exercise, I think. So my question will be like, is it possible to do something like
Was it
that?
possible for something else to happen? Yeah,
like-
okay. Yeah, I mean, Chile is an interesting comparison in part because many of the memorial projects, including now at the National Stadium, are happening 40 years later, right? The problem with September 11th was the memorial process happened very quickly, right? So the design contest was a year into it. And it was just too fraught. People were unable, even architects were unable to imagine something different because it was just too soon, right? And I think had there been a sort of 10-year, nobody can do anything, we would have ended up with something quite different. But that would have been impossible in the context of New York City real estate. And because this real estate developer did have a huge amount of control. He took over the lease of the World Trade Center 6 weeks before the towers were destroyed, and he had a huge amount of power in what happened afterwards. And the city actually had very little power. So there were all these political machinations, and then there was the governor of New York who wanted to run for president, who declared the footprints sacred. Once that happened, it just could not be pulled back. There was the fact that all these families were grieving and they had no remains, and so all these things converged together. On the other hand, I think that there is this kind of, people feel this kind of inevitability about the museum, but in fact actually the plan for the museum was not in place until 5 years later. There were a lot of other ways of conceiving the site, and there was a lot of effort to have cultural institutions at the site, but there's such insanity about any political implication there that it couldn't happen. You know, these cultural institutions, they saw how censorious it was going to be, and they just all pulled out, right? And all of that sort of fell apart. That's why you have this kind of weird pavilion at the museum, which was meant for a completely other kind of institution, right? On top of this much more somber museum. So it is also because of where it was in this major city, and then all of that political stuff. A lot of innovative people recommended it be turned into a park. Lots of New York designers really advocated for a different model, but it was very hard for people to imagine it otherwise. I think there's a lot of embarrassment now in the design community, as you can tell from Michael Kimmelman, about what it has become. The museum design itself has largely been reviewed pretty well, but a lot of people don't like the memorial either. Yeah.
Could you, we were just mentioning now about the political sensitivities. If you elaborate a bit on that, and I was curious, that you, I really would like to know, like, sort of the fact that there's like one picture of Guantanamo, one picture of a few other things. Like, to what extent is there room within the experience of the museum for people to kind of debate the meaning, or is that really not there? I'm just wondering if you could just like sort of elaborate a little bit on, is the museum a place where the narrative is very much controlled? And the reason I was thinking about Guantanamo is that if you go to Guantanamo, every time, every single press conference, every single opening session of any military commission hearing, the prosecution will always sort of reiterate on that sunny day. It's a very mantra. Like, in other words, there's no room for kind of debate or negotiation about that.
There are attempts within the design. I would say the place where that hopefully will happen at the museum is in the programming, right? So they're doing a lot. They have a very nice auditorium. They're doing a lot of programming. A lot of that is about the bigger picture. They were under so many pressures. I don't want to excuse this, because I think that they have really produced a really appalling narrative there. But they were under so many political pressures and pressures from families and other constituencies, including, firefighters, organizations, and other things like that, that it really hemmed them in. And I think they felt that they had to think about the political narrative, but that they, ultimately, this is what we end up with. So you could say, was there an alternate vision? The alternate vision would have been, as anybody who knows anything about these would have told them, do not put a museum at Ground Zero. You will be able to say nothing, right? Except about the heroism of the ordinary people who survived that day. And that's exactly what happens at Oklahoma City. At Oklahoma City, like, they try and talk about the trial, and they're just unable to talk about the why of that event. They can only talk about the resilience of the people in the city. And so the site is too charged, right, for that. So you can see the dilemmas once the project is underway. The woman who is in charge of it, Alice Greenberg, came from the U.S. Holocaust Museum. But I will also say there's a lot of digital stuff, and at the end they invite people to write things that get projected on a wall, and there are these little elements that are meant to be a little bit interactive. There's also a huge amount of recording of stories. So you can, if you have a story, you can go in and have it recorded on the spot. That's part of a much, much larger audio archive, which is actually pretty amazing. So there is some attempt at that, but I think the sense of it as being a self-censored institution is very, very strong. Yeah?
So, thank you for your lecture. See, two things just come to my mind. The first thing is I had the chance to visit the War Memorial and Independence Hall in Seoul, in Korea. Korea. So, you know, just so many elements and components of what you mentioned during your talk just come to mind, and how
And where is it?
Seoul, Korea.
In Seoul.
Yeah. So the Koreans made sure that, you know, people who visited those sites would, you know, that the recollections, the narratives was unified, because probably want to make sure that there was a historical, probably a specific sort of narration narrative to be interpreted or understood from all these different sites and artifacts, as you mentioned. And the second thing I'd like to mention is the war in Lebanon, and what lots of, you know, a whole array, a bunch of artists did during the war and after the war, in the post-war era, where they did a lot of, you know, films and cultural productions that actually specifically talked about the war. So there was an issue here, you know, not necessarily in Korea, but, you know, what refers to Lebanon is the fact that, you know, most of the cases, you know, people wanted to forget about the war. And in some of the instances, these artists, what they did is try to remind us of the war, because there was this, you know, state-sponsored amnesia. So do you think, you know, sites like the one that you talked today about in so much details, it's meant to be to unify the narrative in a way so that, you know, this interpretation of what happened stays just, like someone said, controlled and restricted to one unified interpretation, and so the roots and what it meant was you know, avidly and accurately like handled or approached.
I'm not exactly sure what part of that you want me to answer, but I think, you know, there has been a fair amount of artistic work around 9/11. I have to say, not as much as one might have predicted, right? So this is not the only site of meaning making about it in US culture, but it's certainly the most important, right? And it is certainly the site where what is perceived to be a kind of national story about that event is now, you know, a destination for pedagogy, right? So I mean, part of why I'm looking at it is because it has been constructed as the most important and the most overdetermined site of what happened that day. I mean, there's hundreds of memorials about 9/11 spread throughout the United States, and lots of the steel has been handed out to anybody who asks for it, really. There's going to be a memorial in Shanksville, there's a memorial at the Pentagon. But this is the most overdetermined site, in part because of the spectacular nature of what happened in New York. And it's been overdetermined from September 12th, right? The sort of layerings of meanings there, and all of that does contribute to this kind of closed down way of seeing that. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. There's a really great memorial in Seoul for the Korean comfort women that's across from the Japanese embassy, making the Japanese extremely unhappy. Yeah.
I apologize.
Sort of. No, it's a woman sitting in a chair with an empty chair next to her, and people come and they wrap her in a blanket when it's snowing. Yeah. Yeah, May?
Thanks for reading for that. I wanted to ask you, like, about the gift shop. I really just, I still can't kind of get over that. But, I mean, no, but I mean, what were they thinking?
Well, yeah, the cheese plate was definitely a what were they thinking moment.
Not even like just like the whole thing. Like,
Yeah.
I wonder if like a lot of that criticism came from the gift shop. Like, who decided to include a gift shop in this, and like what are they exactly selling?
Well, you know, early on in the design process, they said, "Oh yeah, of course we have to have a gift shop." I mean, there was a sort of inevitability to it, and you know, looking at these things over the years, I would always use the Holocaust Museum in DC as my sort of, well, it is possible to do it tastefully sort of measure, right? But recently I presented some of this material somewhere, and there was a woman there from the Holocaust Museum, and she was like, "I hate to tell you this, but we sell t-shirts now." You know, so you know, these memory museums already as institutions, they are caught up in that in-between world. They are tourist destinations, right? Conservators will say better that somebody buys a souvenir than tries to chisel something out of a display. You know, people want to take things away from a site. And there was, I mean, there's been so much sort of kitschy stuff about 9/11 sold for so long, right? I think perhaps they thought, I'm most intrigued by the architectural stuff. Perhaps they thought this was a way to sort of tastefully mediate that. But obviously you can see they stumbled in all sorts of ways. I don't think a lot of people mind that they sell this really jingoistic stuff there. That seems like, that doesn't offend people as much. But I mean, there is large, and you see this a lot. This is when the New York Post, you know, it's read by the firefighters, right? That is like their newspaper. They are the working class newspaper, which makes them skew right a lot. I think they just endorsed Trump, right? So they feel that they are talking on behalf of those public servants, many of whom are very unhappy about things being sold there. Yeah. So, yeah.
You mentioned it before, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the comparison between rebuilding and rebuilding downtown.
Well, I think that I wouldn't make as strong a comparison to the museum itself, but I certainly would to the corporate architecture. And I didn't even, there's a few other buildings that are off over here that are still being built, also Starchitect buildings that have gotten a lot less attention, they're still incomplete. So I think the parallels in terms of this kind of combination of banal corporate architecture married with security, defense design, streets that are meant not to have street life, right? Either for security reasons or for reasons of corporatization, right? And the emptying out of street life. Certainly something I really experienced on my little tour yesterday or the day before of downtown Beirut. It's obviously more extreme. The securitization here is way more extreme. It makes Lower Manhattan look, you know, really benign by comparison. And that intersects with these really complicated global financial movements of money that are about, and this is not just around Ground Zero in New York City, this is really what's changing Midtown, which is it's filled with empty condos, very, very expensive empty condos owned by shell corporations that are not required by law to identify their owners or the source of their capital. Right, so that's pretty similar, right? So, you know, there are lots of things that we could call that neoliberal and, you know, et cetera. But the way in which that then intersects with the culture of fear and defensive design and securitization, it really echoes back and forth. I mean, the odd thing here is that is also then effectively integrated with this site of memory, right? Which is also, I mean, people I've taken down there who know how to find this thing say, oh my God, there are so many undercover police here. It's like insane. Everyone's an undercover policeman, right? So you know, there's tons of it on display. There's tons of it that's not on display. And you know, people knew that from the beginning. You know, the memorial was supposed to have an underground gallery. It was a very, very different design initially. It was supposed to have an underground gallery. You would see the names in the underground gallery rather than standing next to this like Niagara Falls, right? And the security people were like, absolutely no way. You know, you would have to go through a scanner to go down to have your contemplative experience, right? And then they said it was too expensive. So, you know, this poor designer apparently has basically had like a nervous breakdown. You know? So, you know, so of course that also, I think we have to see the memory project in relationship to the rest. We can't separate it out. Yeah.
I agree, John, thanks. Have you thought about placing your analysis of this, or the post-9/11 reconstruction of the site, into the longer history of this space as a site of urban renewal from the 50s and 60s on. I mean, that
Yeah.
also has a sort of the interesting Arab American connection.
Oh, the Syrian neighborhood, yes. I was on a panel with the architects, and the Syrian constituency kept calling me on the phone, right? So they feel like they're, yeah, all right. So yes, of course. Well, the whole original complex was a folly to begin with. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was designed to run the ports, and it was never supposed to be in the real estate business. And then they did destroy a very vibrant neighborhood, Radio Row, and a neighborhood with a lot of Syrians in it. And so, people will actually say that the destruction of Radio Row meant that the emergence of the tech economy starting in the 1980s happened in California instead of New York because they destroyed Radio Row. Who knows, right? So, a lot of people hated the Twin Towers and the plaza and that kind of superblock architecture. What was extraordinary was that the minute they were destroyed, they were the source of a huge amount of sentiment and mourning and nostalgia. Just to add to that, you can tell actually, I've thought about this a lot, right? So we can see these economic changes through the neighborhood, right? So they build the original Twin Towers because they think businesses around the port will rent space from us because they need to be in proximity to each other. But that turns out already in the early 70s not to be true. The buildings are never completely full, right? The Port Authority always has offices in them because it can't fill them, right? So then there's a glut of office space, which is why the folly of creating the same amount of office space here, according to the insurance stuff and the real estate industry. Everyone's been arguing about that for 15 years now. So the Twin Towers were always sort of out of date in relationship to the local economy. Now, by the time they are, after the bombing of the Twin Towers in '93, huge numbers of corporations move their facilities out. They regionalize. They move to New Jersey. They move to Connecticut. There's too much office space in Lower Manhattan. And they don't need to be close. Everything's increasingly virtual, right? So by the time the towers are destroyed, it's really a neighborhood that is looking for residential space, which is the massive, massive market now in New York City. But all of this could not, it was almost like the conceptualization of the space was in a time warp, right? So in fact, actually, we've ended up with office towers. Now, if they built a condo building right next to Ground Zero, would somebody want to live there? I mean, obviously these things were endlessly debated. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What happened to the Muslim?
Oh, area yeah. Well, it's.
Or
I forget the exact. I'm blanking on the name of it now. 51. It's a multi-religious cultural center that produced complete hysteria because it's 5 blocks away, right? So there you can really see that the idea of sacredness reaches out pretty far, right? The people who were in charge of it kind of sat out for a while, the controversy, but it's going forward in a kind of downsized way, is my understanding. Way under the radar now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But there too, right? If you can't do something 5 blocks away that then produces this kind of response, then can you have a shopping mall across the street, right? A lot of it is very unclear.
Okay. In terms of downtown Beirut, if you think of downtown Beirut, the reconstruction of it, and the immediate aftermath of the reconstruction, it was actually a magnet for people. It brought life back to the downtown core, and so for the first few years, until basically the political situation changed and Hezbollah set up tents down there. But up until that time, you could not walk around downtown because there were so many people. So it actually was a space that was designed to bring people back.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of the political situation over the last few years has resulted in increased security and then people like not going down there again. So it's kind of shifted from its original purpose, because you couldn't like, you know, it was always so packed you couldn't walk down.
Interesting.
In the early days of the kind of the.
In the early days of the Solidaire construction.
Yeah. I mean,
A few streets were.
Yeah.
well, the part that they built, like by the Nishmi Square, by Harlem, like the very part where now you can't enter.
Right.
You move down there. Like, it was just always packed. But
But
yeah,
very confusing.
I mean, yeah, but I'm just saying, like, there were people that were down there, going down there. But yeah, I agree.
Well, I'll just give you one tiny little anecdote, right, which is that Condé Nast, of course, is a huge publisher, and they publish a lot of fashion magazines, including, but also like the New Yorker and other magazines now. They're a big conglomerate. And so when they were first moving down about 6 months ago, or maybe even a year ago now, the auxiliary businesses that you know support them had to move from 42nd Street downtown, and so you know. Hair salons that do blowouts, nail salons, so lots of stuff that is part of the fashion industry. And so they were all sort of searching for spaces, you know, within walking distance of One World Trade Center, where of course there are no storefronts, right? And so they figured out that because of the high heel factor, they had maybe 3 blocks, and then that was it, that people who worked at Condé Nast wouldn't walk further than 3 blocks to have their blowout. So I think you really got to think about urban design all the way down to the shoe, right? It's the micro matters as much as the macro, right? These are things that real estate agents were talking about, yeah. So. Okay, thank you.